exclaimed the emperor. Very well. This is what is called being free from prejudices. These are real philosophical views. And it will be said of you that you were enabled to convert to your advantage the lessons of time and adversity. Sire, during our stay on board of the Northumberland and the leisure hours of our passage, the English alluded more than once to this delicate topic, misled by the war which they had carried on with fury against us, as well as by the maxims with which the interest of the moment filled their journals, even in opposition to their national doctrines. They conversed about the merits of the emigration and the virtues they had witnessed, and condemned the nation for having resisted it. But when the arguments became too complicated, or when we were desirous of putting a sudden stop to them, we gained our point with a single word. We merely said to them, go back to the period of your own revolution. Imagine James II threatening you from the opposite shore and under French banners. Although surrounded by faithful subjects, what would you have done? And if Louis XIV had brought him back to London at the head of 50,000 French, who should have afterwards maintained garrisons in your country, what would have been your feelings? They exclaimed, endeavoring to find out some difference. But not being able to discover it, they laughed and were silent. In fact, said the emperor, there was not a word to be said in reply. He then occupied himself with his accustomed rapidity and talent in taking a review of the different objects I had noticed, and stopped to reflect on the absurdity, the inconsistency, the great mistake of our emigration, and the great injuries it had done to France, to the king, and to ourselves. You have established and consecrated in political France, he observed, a separation similar to that which the Catholics and Protestants introduced into religious Europe. And what calamities has it not given rise? I had succeeded in destroying its results, but are they not on the point of being revived? He next developed the means he had taken to annihilate that plague, the precautions he had been forced to adopt, and the effects which he had in view. How everything that fell from his tongue was changed in its appearance. How everything seemed magnified in my eyes in proportion as he discussed the subject. And what he remarked, a peculiar singularity in my situation was that in the whole of those transactions I held the helm myself, constantly in the midst of rocks, every one judging according to his own standard, attributed to passion, to simple prejudice, or to littleness. What in me, however, was but the consequence of profound views, of grand conceptions, and the most elevated state maxims. It might have been said that I reigned only over pygmies with respect to intellectual talent. I was comprehended by none. The national party felt only jealousy and resentment at what they saw me do in favor of the emigrants, and that latter, on their part, were persuaded that I sought only to gain fresh luster by their assistance. Poor people! I obtained, however, my object in spite of reciprocal infatuation and prejudice, and I had the satisfaction of leaving everything quiet in port when I launched out to sea in pursuit of my grand enterprises. Having mentioned since my return to Europe these expressions of Napoleon to a great officer of the crown, who had often the honor of conversing with him in private, Comte d'S, he related to me in his turn a conversation precisely on the same subject. Its coincidence with what has been just read is so very striking as to induce me to insert it here. The emperor said to him one day, "What, think you, is my reason for endeavoring to have about me the great names of the ancient monarchy? Perhaps, sire, for the splendor of your throne, and for the purpose of keeping up certain appearances in the eyes of Europe?" That is just like you, with your pride and your prejudices of rank. Well then, learn that my victories and my power are much better recommendations for me in Europe than all your great names, and that my apparent predilection for them does me a great deal of injury and renders me very unpopular at home. You attribute to narrow views what relates to those of a very extensive scope. I am engaged in renovating a society, a nation, and the elements I am obliged to employ are altogether repugnant in their nature. The nobility and the emigrants are but a point on the mass, and that mass is hostile to them and continues very much exasperated against them. It is hardly forgives me for having recalled them. For my own part, I considered it a duty, but if I suffer them to continue as a body, they may one day be serviceable to foreign powers, prove injurious to us, and subject themselves to great dangers. My object then is to dissolve their union and to render them independent of each other. If I place some of them about my person in the different branches of administration and in the army, it is for the purpose of consolidating them with the mass and of managing so as to reduce all classes into a whole. For I am mortal, and if I should happen to leave you before that fusion was accomplished, you would soon see what disasters would arise from these heterogeneous parts, and the dreadful perils of which certain persons might become the victims. Thus, then, sir, my views are all connected with humanity and elevated political considerations, and in no respect with vain and silly prejudices. When I observed to the person who related this anecdote how little we were acquainted at the Tuileries with Napoleon's real character and the grand and excellent qualities of his soul and heart, he answered that for his own part he had been personally more fortunate in that he would give me a proof of it, which he selected out of 10. The emperor showed himself one day in his privy council very much incensed against General Laef, whom he attacked with great severity, and whose opinions and principles, he said, were capable of effecting the complete dissolution of a state. Becoming animated by degrees, he at length put himself into a real passion. I was present as a member of the council. I had been recently admitted and was little fashioned to the emperor's manners, and although stopped by the two members placed next to me, I understood to speak in defense of the accused, asserting that he had been calumniated with the sovereign and that he lived quietly on his estate with personal opinions which were productive of no ill effect whatever. The emperor, still in a passion, resumed the charge for the purpose of pressing it with vehemence, but at the end of 5 or 6 words he stopped short and, addressing himself to me, said, "Be he's your friend, sir. You were right. I had forgotten it. Let us speak of something else. And why," I asked, "did you not make us acquainted with all this at the time?" "By a fatality which would seem to belong to Napoleon's atmosphere. Whether from prejudice or otherwise, the impression on our minds was that it could only be told to his intimate friends, for whoever has said much about it would only have passed for a clumsy romancer of a courtier, who told not what he believed to be true, but what he conceived best suited to obtain favor and rewards. Since I have mentioned this great officer of the crown, who is no less distinguished by the graces of his mind and the amenity of his manners than by his exalted character, I shall notice one of his answers to Napoleon, remarkable for its ingenious and delicate flattery. The emperor, at one of his levees, having been obliged to wait some time for his appearance, attacked him on his arrival openly in the presence of all. It happened to be precisely at the time when 5 or 6 kings, among others those of Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg, were at Paris. "Sire," replied the guilty courtier, "I have no doubt a million of excuses to make to your majesty, but at this time one is not at perfect liberty to go through the streets as one pleases. I just now had the misfortune to get into a crowd of kings, from which I found it impossible to extricate myself sooner. This, sire, was the cause of my delay." Everyone smiled, and the emperor contented himself with saying in a very softened tone of voice, "Whatever, sir, may be the cause, take proper precautions for the future, and above all, never make me wait again." The third, the weather somewhat improved. The emperor attempted to take a walk in the garden. General Bingham and the colonel of the 53rd requested to see the emperor, who kept them rather long. The appearance of the governor put us all to flight. General Bingham disappeared, and for our part, we went to the wood for the purpose of keeping away from the spot. The emperor, during his walk, conversed a great deal about a journey which he took to Burgundy in the beginning of the Revolution. This he calls his sentimental journey to Nitz. He supped there with his comrade Gassendi, at that time captain in the same regiment, who was advantageously married to the daughter of a physician of the place. The young traveler soon remarked the difference of political opinion between the father and son-in-law. The gentleman Gassendi was, of course, an aristocrat, and the physician a flaming patriot. The latter found in the strange guest a powerful auxiliary, and was so delighted with him that the following day at dawn he paid him a visit of acknowledgment and sympathy. The appearance of a young officer of artillery with good logical reasoning and a ready tongue was observed the emperor, a precious and rare accession to the place. It was easy for the traveler to perceive that he made an impression in his favor. It was Sunday, and hats were taken off to him from the bottom of the street. His triumph, however, was not without a check. He went to sup at the house of Madame Mure, where another of his comrades, V, seemed to be comfortably established. Here the aristocracy of the canton were accustomed to meet, although the mistress was but the wife of a wine merchant. But she had great property and the most polished manners. She was, said the emperor, the duchess of the place. All the gentlefolks of the vicinity were to be found there. The young officer was caught, as he remarked, in a real wasp hole, and it was necessary for him to fight his way out again. The contest was unequal. In the very heat of the action, the mayor was announced. I believed him to be an assistant sent to me by heaven in the critical moment. But he was the worst of all my opponents. I see this villainous fellow now before me in his fine Sunday clothes, fat and bloated, in a large crimson coat. He was a miserable animal. I was happily preserved by the generosity of the mistress of the house, perhaps by a secret sympathy of opinion. She unceasingly parried with her wit the blows which were dealt at me, and was a protecting shield on which the enemy's weapons struck in vain. She guarded me from every kind of wound, and I have always retained a pleasing recollection of the services I received from her in that species of skirmish. The same diversity of opinions, said the emperor, was then to be met with in every part of France, in the saloons, in the streets, on the highways, in the taverns. Everyone was ready to take part in the contest, and nothing was easier than for a person to form an erroneous estimate of the influence of parties and opinions according to the local situation in which he was placed. Thus a patriot might easily be deceived when in the saloons or among an assembly of officers where the majority was decidedly against him. But the instant he was in the street or among the soldiers, he found himself in the midst of the entire nation. The sentiments of the day succeeded even in making proselytes among the officers themselves, particularly after the celebrated oath to the nation, the law, and the king. Until that time, continued the emperor, had I received an order to point my cannon against the people, I have no doubt that custom, prejudice, education, and the name of the king would have induced me to obey. But the national oath once taken, this would have ceased, and I should have acknowledged the nation only. My natural propensities thenceforth harmonized with my duties, and happily accorded with all the metaphysics of the assembly. The patriotic officers, however, it must be allowed, constituted but the smaller number. But with the soldiers as a lever, they led the regiment and imposed the law. The comrades of the opposite party and the principals themselves had recourse to us in every moment of the crisis. I remember, for instance, having rescued from the fury of the populace a brother officer whose crime consisted in singing from the windows of our dining saloon the celebrated romance of "O Richard, O mon roi." I had little notion then that error would one day also be prescribed in the same manner on my account. Just so on the 10th of August, when I saw the palace of the Tuileries carried by force and the person of the king seized upon, I was certainly very far from thinking that I should replace him, and that palace would be my place of residence. In dwelling upon the events of the 10th of August, he said, I was, during that horrible epoch, at Paris in lodgings in the Rue de Mai, Place de Victoire. On hearing the sound of the tocsin and the news which were circulated of the assault upon the Tuileries, I ran to the carousel, to the house of Fauvelet, the brother of Brienne, who kept the furniture warehouse. He had been my comrade at the military school of Brienne. It was from that house, which, by the by, I was never afterwards able to find a consequence of the great altercations effected there, that I saw the particulars of the attack before I reached the carousel. I had been met by a group of hideous-looking men carrying a head at the end of a pike. Seeing me tolerably well dressed, with the appearance of a gentleman, they called upon me to shout "Vive la Nation," which, as it may be easily he believed, I did without hesitation, the palace was attacked by the vilest rabble. The king had unquestionably for his defense as many troops as the convention afterwards had on the 13th Vendemiaire, and the enemies of the latter were much more disciplined and formidable. The greater part of the National Guard showed themselves favorable to the king. This justice is due to them. Here the Grand Marshal observed that he actually belonged to one of the battalions that evinced the most determined devotion. He was several times on the point of being massacred as he returned alone to his residence. We remarked on our part that, in general, the National Guard of Paris had constantly displayed the virtues of its class, the love of order, devotedness to authority, the dread of plunder, and the detestation of anarchy. And that also, that was the emperor's opinion, the palace being forced, and the king received within the bosom of the assembly. Continued he, I ventured to penetrate into the garden. Never since has any of my fields of battle given me the idea of so many dead bodies as I was impressed with by the heaps of the Swiss, whether the smallness of the place seemed to increase the number, or that it was the result of the first impression I experienced of that nature. I saw well-dressed women commit the grossest indecencies on the dead bodies of the Swiss. I went through all the coffee houses in the neighborhoods of the assembly. The irritation was everywhere extreme. Fury was in every heart and showed itself in every countenance, although the persons thus inflamed were far from belonging to the class of the populace, and all these places must necessarily have been frequented daily by the same visitors. For although I had nothing in particular in my dress, or perhaps it was because my face was more calm, it was easy for me to perceive that I excited many hostile and distrustful looks, as someone unknown or suspected. The 4th, the weather was much improved. The emperor ordered his calash and walked very far until it took him up. The conversation turned upon masked balls, of which the emperor was peculiarly fond and frequently called for them. He was then always sure of a certain rendezvous which never failed to take place. He was, he said, regularly accosted every year by the same mask who reminded him of old intimacies and ardently entreated to be received and admitted at court. The mask was a most amiable, kind, and beautiful woman to whom many persons were certainly much indebted. The emperor, who continued to love her, always answered, I do not deny that you are charming, but reflect a little upon your situation. Be your own judge and decide. You have 2 or 3 husbands and children by several of your lovers. It would have been thought a happiness to have shared in the first fault. The second would have caused pain, but still it might be pardoned. But the sequel, and then. Be the emperor judge. What would you do in my place? I, who am bound to revive, had maintained a certain decorum. The beautiful suitor either did not reply or said, at least do not deprive me of hope, and deferred her claims of happiness to the following year. And each of us, said the emperor, was punctual at the new rendezvous. The emperor took great pleasure in getting himself insulted at these balls. He laughed heartily at Cambacérès one day at being told by a Madame de Saint-Die that there were people at the ball who ought to be turned out, and that they certainly could not have gotten admittance without stolen tickets. Another time he forced the tender and timid Madame de Magrigny to rise and retire in anger, and with tears in her eyes complaining that the freedom allowed her to masked ball had in her instance been sadly abused. The emperor had just put her in mind of a very remarkable favor which he had formerly granted to her, and added that everyone thought she had paid for it by the exercise of the Lord's right. But there was, said the emperor, nobody but myself could say so without insulting her, because, although such was the report, I was certain of its falsehood. The following is an account of the circumstance. When the emperor was on his way to be crowned at Milan, he slept at Troy. The authorities were presented to him, and with them was a young lady on the point of being married, with a petition entreating his protection, desirous of doing something which might produce a good effect and prove agreeable to the country. The circumstance appeared favorable, and he took advantage of it with all the imaginable grace. The young lady, Madame de Magrigny, belonged to the first families of this province, but which had been completely ruined by the emigration. She had scarcely returned to the miserable abode of her parents when a page arrived with the emperor's decree, which put them in possession of 30,000 francs, rent or more. The effect of such a proceeding may well be imagined. However, as the young lady was very charming and perfectly handsome, it was decided that her fascinations had some share in his gallantry, although he left the town a few hours afterwards and never thought more of the thing. But the general opinion was not a jot altered on that account. It is well known how stories are formed, and as she married one of his equerries and had consequently come to court, all this had been so well mingled together that when she was appointed sub-governess to the King of Rome, the choice shocked for a moment the austere Madame de Montesquieu, who suspected, said the Emperor, that it was but a mere arrangement. The Emperor said that he renewed at Turin, in the person of Madame de Lascaris, the gracious gallantry exercised at Troy, and that in both instances he had reason to be gratified with the fruits of his liberality. The two families gave every possible proof of attachment and gratitude. We inquired what might have been the sentiments of Piedmont with regard to himself. He had, he said, a particular affection for that province. Monsieur de Saint-Marsin, on whose fidelity he relied to the end, had assured him at that period of our reverses that the country would show itself one of his best provinces. In fact, continued the Emperor, the Piedmontese do not like to be a small state. Their king was a real feudal lord whom it was necessary to pay court to or to dread. He had more power and authority than I, who as Emperor of the French was but a supreme magistrate, bound to see the laws executed and incompetent to dispense with them. Had I it in my power to prevent the arrest of a courtier for debt, could I have put a stop to the regular action of the laws, no matter upon whom they operated? During the conversation at dinner, the Emperor inquired whether the quantity of river water which flowed into the Mediterranean and the Black Sea had been calculated. This led him to express a wish that a calculation of the fluvial water of our Europe should be made, and that the proportion contributed by each torrent and waterfall should be ascertained. He regretted much that he had not presented that series of scientific questions. That was, he observed, his grand system. Did any useful, curious, or interesting question suggest itself to him, I proposed it by levees or in my familiar communications analogous questions to the members of the Institute with orders to resolve them. The solution became the subject of public inquiry. It was analyzed, contested, adopted, and rejected. And there is nothing which cannot be accomplished in this way. It is the grand lever of improvement for a great nation that possesses a great deal of intelligence and a great deal of knowledge. The Emperor also observed on this subject that geography had never been so successfully cultivated as at present, and that his expeditions had contributed somewhat to its improvement. He afterwards noticed the canals which he had caused to be made in France, and particularly mentioned that from Strasbourg to Lyon, in which he hoped sufficient progress had been made to induce others to complete it. He thought that out of 30 millions, 24 must have already been expanded. Communications are now established in the interior from Bordeaux to Lyon and Paris. I had constructed a great number of canals and projected a great many more, one of us having observed that a proposal for the construction of a very useful canal had been submitted to the Emperor, but that measures had been taken to deceive him for the purpose of preventing his acceptance of the offer. Without doubt, said the Emperor, the plan must have appeared advantageous only on paper, but I suppose it would have been necessary to advance money, which was drawn from me with difficulty. No, sire, the refusal was but the effect of an intrigue. Your Majesty was deceived. It was impossible with respect to such a subject. You speak without sufficient information. But I am confident of it. I was acquainted with the plan, the offers, and the subscribers. My relations had put down their names for considerable sums. The intended object was the union of the Meuse with the Marne. The extent of the canal would have been less than 7 leagues. But you do not tell us all. It was perhaps required that I should grant away immense national forests and environs, which I should not have agreed to. No, sire. The whole was an intrigue of your board of bridges and roads. But even then it was necessary for them to allege some reason, some appearance of public interest. What reasons did they assign? Sire, that the profits would have been too considerable. But in that case, the plan ought to have been submitted to me in person, and I would have carried it into execution. I repeat that you are not justified by the facts. You are speaking now to a man upon the very subject which constantly engaged his attention. The border bridges and roads were, on their part, never happier than when they were employed. There never was an individual who proposed the construction of a bridge that was not taken at his word. If he asked for a toll for 25 years, I was disposed to grant him one for 30. If it cost me nothing, it was a matter of indifference whether it would prove useful. It was always a capital with which I enriched the soil. Instead of rejecting proposals for canals, I eagerly courted them. But, my dear sir, there are no two things that resemble each other so little as the conversation of a saloon and the consideration of an administrative council. The projector is always right in a saloon. His projects would be magnificent and infallible if he were listened to, and if he can by some little contrivance but connect the refusal under which he suffers with some bottles of wine, with some intrigue carried on by a wife or mistress, the romance is complete. And that is what you probably heard. But an administrative council is not to be managed so, because it comes to no decision but on facts and accurate measurement. What is a canal you mentioned? I cannot be unacquainted with it. Sire, from the Meuse to the Marne, a distance of 7 leagues only. Very well, my dear sir. It is from the Meuse to the Aisne, you mean to say, and it would have been less than 7 leagues. I shall soon recollect all about it. There is, however, but one little difficulty to overcome, and that is that at this very instant it is doubtful whether the project be practicable. There, as in other places, Hippocrates says yes and Galen says no. Tarbet maintained that it was impossible and denied that there was a sufficiency of water at the points of separation. I repeat that you are speaking to him who, of all others, is the most attentive to these objects, more especially in the environs of Paris. I was the subject of my perpetual dreams to render Paris the real capital of Europe. I sometimes wished it, for instance, to become a city with a population of 2, 3, or 4 millions. In a word, something fabulous, colossal, unexampled until our days, and with public establishments suitable to its population. Someone having then observed that if heaven had allowed the emperor to reign 60 years, as it had with Louis XIV, he would have left many grand monuments. Had heaven but granted me 20 years and a little more leisure, resumed the emperor with vivacity, ancient Paris would have been sought for in vain. Not a trace of it would have been left, and I should have changed the face of France. Archimedes promised everything, promised he was supplied with a resting place for his lever. I should have done as much wherever I could have found a point of support for my energy, my perseverance, and my budgets. A world might be created with budgets. I should have displayed the difference between a constitutional emperor and a king of France. The kings of France have never possessed any administrative or municipal institution. They have merely shown themselves great lords who ruin their men of business. The nation itself has nothing in its character but what is transitory and perishable. Everything is done for the gratification of the moment, out of caprice, nothing for duration. That is our motto, and it is exemplified by our manners in France. Everyone passes his life in doing and undoing. Nothing is ever left behind. It is not unbecoming that Paris should not possess even a French theater or an opera house in any respect worthy of its high claims. I have often set myself against the feasts which the city of Paris wished to give me. They consisted of dinners, balls, artificial fireworks at an expense of 4, 6, and 800,000 francs, the preparations for which obstructed the public for several days, and which afterwards cost as much to take away as they had in their construction. I proved that with these idle expenses they might have erected lasting and magnificent monuments. One must have gone through as much as I have in order to be acquainted with all the difficulty of doing good. If the business related to chimneys, partitions, and furniture for some individuals in the imperial palaces, the work was quick and effectual. But if it was necessary to lengthen the garden of the Tuileries, to render some quarters wholesome, to clean some sewers, and to accomplish a task beneficial to the public in which some particular person had no direct interest, I found it requisite to exert all the energy of my character, to write 6, 10 letters a day, and to get into a downright passion. It was in this way that I laid out as much as 30 millions in sewers for which nobody will ever thank me. I pulled down a property of 17 millions in houses in front of the Tuileries for the purpose of forming the carousel and throwing open the Louvre. What I did is immense. What I had resolved to do and what I projected were still much more so.